Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I've recently read, and I'm going to be talking about two in this edition, both of which I read in June. First one is nonfiction, Adams versus Jefferson, The Tumultuous Election of 1800 by John Ferling, and also a reread, Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. So, first off, talk about this history book. I had this on my shelf for a really long time, and this month I also read Charles Brockden Brown's Wieland, which is the first American Gothic novel, published in 1798, and it got me thinking about that time period, of course, lead up to the election of 1800, and decided I'm finally going to actually get down to reading this book. I've had a long fascination, especially with Thomas Jefferson, but also John Adams, and in particular, also their friendship. They developed a very close friendship at one point, especially when they were both serving in France. And then this whole political process, as the fledgling American government became more and more, not just, well, I guess you say polarized through political parties. They really ended up joining opposite sides of that political spectrum. And things happened that really soured their friendship. They didn't speak for many years, basically, until they were both old and retired from government. And then they picked up a correspondence through letters that was very fruitful and became fast friends again through letter writing. Until they both happened to die on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, quite famously. So I was actually hoping that I would get more insight into that friendship and how it soured, and we do definitely get that in this. However, I wish that there was a little bit more there. Ferling spends the first half of the book really kind of giving us background into these guys and the different political figures that are also in this, especially some of the other candidates that were a part of that election of 1800. Sometimes maybe it's too much background information. I'm not sure that he had to go as far back and as in-depth as he needed to. I was glad that he addressed Thomas Jefferson's owning of slaves, although he does seem to actively try to avoid the word slave at times. I'm not sure why. He only uses it very few times. We also see things like bondsman and chattel. But I kind of wish that would just be more blunt as far as the fact that we're talking about slavery with Jefferson. But he does seem to have a little bit more sympathy for Jefferson. Sometimes he seems a little bit critical and harsh on Adams. But we do start moving into the election process, 1800. That stuff, of course, gets quite interesting. Although in the second half, I felt like as the election process was happening, we got a little bit bogged down in some details. You kind of feel like the narrative gets stuck, in the mire of what political movements were happening in which state, and you got to struggle to keep it in your head exactly when and where certain things are happening. But ultimately, John Ferling does bring home the idea that the election of 1800s was significant for a very special reason. You had two very bitterly rival political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, really railing against each other. And it was a dirty campaign, run really by both sides. Terrible things said about both of these men. And yet, what the process showed was that power can pass from one political party to another, from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans, from Adams to Jefferson, in a bloodless way. This was a peaceful transition of power from one rival faction to another. Something that history did not have much precedence of. And that's really the significant factor of this election. We saw a major transference of power from one side to another, and it was bloodless. If you don't count Alexander Hamilton being shot for the things that he said about Aaron Burr. But overall, I'm glad I read it. It's a pretty solid look at the election process. I'm not sure I'm kind of guessing there's probably more compelling books out there when it comes to the relationship between these two gentlemen. So, for diehards, I would definitely recommend it, but, it's not a really strong recommendation, but I did like it, and I'm glad that I read it. And then I ended up rereading Michael Crichton, Eaters of the Dead. Earlier this month, I had read Dragon Teeth, the posthumously published Michael Crichton book about the Bone Wars. And it got me thinking about this book again. And I had read this originally over 20 years ago, after the movie 13th Warrior first came out, which I was a big fan of, and I still enjoy it. It is goofy in a lot of ways. I do wish that that film took the history, even though it's a fictional history, I do wish that it took the history a little more seriously. It doesn't make sense that some of these Viking warriors would be wearing like conquistador armor or gladiator armor and, kilts. I treat that movie more as a fantasy than as any kind of historical fiction. In fact, in my DVD section, I do have my historical dramas actually arranged fairly chronologically. That's just because the way my brain works. But 13th Warrior, I have that DVD, but it's in my fantasy section. So it's a fun movie. I enjoy it, but I would actually like to see this remade and have the Viking history portion just being taken a little more seriously. Because I think this book deserves it. I love this book when I read it over 20 years ago, and on this reread, I had a blast with it. I do think it's a fantastic book. And what it is, originally published in the late 70s, I believe. This came about because of a conversation that Crichton had with, 76, a friend or colleague. They had joked about how they wanted to teach a course, a literary course, called basically The Great Bores. The boring things that people were forced to read that are the canon of Western literature. And one of the first things he mentioned was Beowulf. And Crichton strongly disagreed with that and said, no, Beowulf is fantastic. It's adventurous. It's epic. And I totally agree with that. And that's what inspired him to start writing this. So this is essentially a retelling of Beowulf, but told from an outsider. And it's like Crichton is giving us a plausible, somewhat plausible, not entirely. He definitely takes a lot of liberal decisions with this. But what could have been a scenario that would have later been written about poetically as the story of Beowulf. And he does it through a real historical figure, Ibn Fadlan, who did actually, he was a traveler from the Middle East. He did come across some Vikings, and he witnessed a Viking funeral. And he goes into great detail about this multi-day funeral process, about very harrowing process. I mean, those kind of funerals were nasty stuff. But it's an invaluable account of Viking life during the medieval era. And then Crichton continues Fadlan's journey. Fadlan, I think his journey with the Vikings pretty much ended there. But he has it where he is chosen as a 13th warrior to join a group of Vikings led by Bolvi, basically the Beowulf character, where they have to go up north into the Northlands to save a kingdom that is crumbling and under siege by a group of eaters of the dead, basically cannibals, called the Vendel, which we kind of get a little bit of a, close to Grendel. So we have certain things where if you know the Beowulf story, you can see how things that happen in here would have been interpreted later on as things with Beowulf, like Grendel's arm being ripped off, or going into an underwater cave to kill Grendel's mother, a dragon that has to be fought. And we see that those things, they're not quite what they are in Beowulf, of course, that Beowulf has been more mythologized. So it's a little bit more of a realistic, quote-unquote, look at that. And it's through the eyes of the outsider, Ibn Fadlan. So he's telling us about Viking culture, he's getting to know these Vikings that he's with, and you really do get the sense that the bond that he shares with these people that he doesn't understand at first and that he finds disgusting, how much those bonds grow over time. how much he ends up liking them, how much they accept him as one of their own, the mutual respect that both sides, really show. And it's filled with adventure and fighting and humor and, great little cultural tidbits and culture clashes. And it is told, like I said, this is like it's pretending like this is a translation of what Ibn Fadlan wrote, which is fake. And then he has like a scholarly exegesis, a fake one happening here. There's all kinds of, footnotes down here, fake footnotes from fake scholars. And then he even gives us find the page here, a fake appendix about the sources and fake sources. Here's primary and secondary sources. And these are all fake books. Everything in here is made up, but it's done very convincingly. He knew his stuff. Crichton was obviously very familiar with a lot of the scholarship at the time because he was able to imitate it so well. And that's what I think, that's what got me thinking about this book. When I read Dragon Teeth, I thought, he really does a great job capturing a certain historical era. And once again, he does. You can feel Crichton's love of history within this. And just a great knack for storytelling. It's a pretty quick read. This is only about 200-something pages. And really, the text is fairly large with some spacing. You can get through this really in no time. The only factual stuff in this book is he has a factual note on Eaters of the Dead at the end where he talks about how this was created. And I think he wrote this back in 1994. I'm sure there were many people who picked this up in the 70s not realizing how much of this was completely fake. He even talks about going to look for one of the sources that he listed and becoming frustrated because he didn't realize that he had made it up years beforehand. Through that, he also cautions us against, too much postmodernist thinking about, not really clearly distinguishing between fact and fiction. But I highly recommend this, especially if you love Beowulf, if you love this era. This is just a great adventure story. I had a blast with this again. And once again, 13th Warriors was at least 20 years old now, if not more. It's due for another remake. I'd love to see that. But those are the two books that I'm going to talk about right now for this edition. So first I read Adams versus Jefferson, The Tumultuous Election of 1800 by John Ferling, and then Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. And if you've read either of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you, BookTube.